The Charabanc Outing. Gerald Osworth boarded the Charabanc that morning at 28 minutes past 8, found his seat in the 5th row, and was dead before 4 o'clock that afternoon at the foot of the Penmouth cliff path. That much was not in dispute. What remained disputed, with absolute sincerity by every one of the 17 passengers who had made the annual outing of Brambleton-under-Ash's Women's Institute that Tuesday, was that all of them, without exception, had seen him reboard the coach at the seafront. They had seen him, they would swear to it. Yet Gerald Osworth had been dead for 2 hours by the time the Charabanc finally reached the village. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your new host, here with you from Ohio, and tonight's story is about something I find far more unsettling than a deliberate lie. The honest witness who turns out to be completely, irreversibly wrong. Before we get to the coach and the cliff and the blue coat that somehow seems to be everywhere at once, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever been absolutely certain you saw something, a face, a person, a moment, and then discovered the certainty itself was the mistake, not the seeing? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Tonight's story will give you quite a lot to say. Now, the coach is at the top of Church Lane. Let us take our seats. Chapter 1. The Morning List. The Charabanc stood at the top of Church Lane at 20 minutes past 8 on a Tuesday morning in late August, and it was, by general consensus, the most anticipated event in Brambleton-under-Ash since the new stile at the Lower Meadow had collapsed under the combined weight of the Fordham twins and a good deal of complicated feeling about who was responsible for maintaining it. The annual summer outing was a fixture of the Women's Institute calendar, so firmly established that the village had long since stopped thinking of it as a discretionary activity, and had come to regard it instead in the way one regards the tides, a natural event, regular and inevitable, to be prepared for rather than decided upon. Miss Marple had been invited by Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, whose husband held the living at St. Cuthbert's, and who had organized the outing, as she organized everything that fell within her orbit, which was to say comprehensively and in triplicate. The boarding list had been posted on the village hall door for a fortnight preceding the day, and had been amended twice when Mrs. Beach added her husband at the last moment, and when young Tom Granger asked whether his wife might come, as she had never seen the sea in Penmouth, and he thought it would be a pleasant thing. Mrs. Hartwell had said yes to both requests, with the warmth and faint weariness of someone accustomed to managing the variable of other people. Miss Marple had come to Brambleton-under-Ash 4 days earlier at Mrs. Hartwell's invitation, and had been staying at the Lamb and Anchor, which had a comfortable room on the 1st floor, and a landlady whose cooking ran heavily to game pies, and who considered vegetables a courtesy rather than a nutritional necessity. She had spent 4 days walking the village lanes at the gentle pace of a woman who has nowhere particular to go, and is finding a great deal of interest in not arriving. Brambleton-under-Ash was a village of 430 souls arranged around a green, a church, a pub, and the social geography of 15 years of accumulated knowledge and grievance that makes English village life such a rich and inexhaustible study in how much a small community can know about itself without ever quite saying it plainly. She settled herself in the 2nd row on the left-hand side, which gave her an unimpeded view of the full interior of the vehicle, and the advantage of being positioned neither at the very front, where Mrs. Hartwell was conducting operations, nor at the very back, where the Beach couple had established themselves, and Mr. Beach's opinions about motor travel were already making themselves audible. She arranged her handbag with the methodical consideration of someone planning a long campaign, set her knitting bag beside it, and looked about her with the unhurried attention she had spent a good many years cultivating. Gerald Osworth boarded at 28 minutes past 8. He was a large man, large in the way of men who had been physically substantial in youth and had retained the architecture if not the occupation, the frame of an athlete now devoted entirely to settling into rooms and making them smaller. He was 58, a retired solicitor, and he had the face of a man who had been professionally right about things for so long that the habit had extended itself into every other area of life, without his noticing or minding. He moved directly to row 5 on the left-hand side, settled himself with the ease of someone who expects the space to accommodate him, and had produced a folded newspaper before the seat had quite received him. Mrs. Evelyn Petch boarded at 29 minutes past 8. She was a small woman, considerably smaller than she had probably been at 40. The years had done what they do to the merely quiet, which is to make them quieter, and she wore a coat the color of a summer sky at its most insistent, a particular vivid blue, Saxon in its directness, which was the most arresting thing about her. She carried herself with the care of someone accustomed to taking up only the space she had been allocated, and she took her seat in row 3, on the right-hand side, window seat, arranged her bag on the adjacent seat in a way that was not unwelcoming, but was not precisely welcoming either, and looked out of the window at the village green, with the expression of a woman who has things on her mind, and prefers that the things remain where they are. Mr. Thomas Cragg boarded last, at 8:30 precisely. He was a retired grocer of some 16 years' standing, a large-framed man of 63, with a bald head, a habitually pleasant expression, and a reputation for remembering the price of everything he had ever sold, which he shared freely and without prompting. He took row 4 on the left-hand side, nodded affably to the people he could see, who was essentially everyone, and settled in with the equable contentment of a man who finds the world, on balance, to have worked out satisfactorily. At 28 minutes and 40 seconds past 8, she would not have mentioned the seconds to anyone, as it was not the sort of precision that came across well in conversation. Miss Marple watched Gerald Osworth receive a folded piece of paper from someone passing the coach window. The passing was quick and deliberate, the sort of action that is designed to be overlooked, and achieves this with complete success, because nobody was looking at the coach window except Miss Marple. Osworth pocketed the paper without unfolding it. His expression did not alter by any perceptible degree. He returned to his newspaper. Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The coach pulled away from Church Lane at 9 o'clock precisely, and the annual outing of the Brambleton Under Ash Women's Institute commenced. Chapter 2. The Halfway House. The halfway house stood at the 40-mile point of the road to Penmouth-on-Sea, and had been standing there, in various states of architectural compromise, since the coaching era. It was the sort of establishment that wears its age the way an old soldier wears his campaign ribbons, with complete honesty about what it has been through, and no intention of apologizing for any of it. It offered tea, biscuits, a car park, and the sort of facilities that are not mentioned by name in the W.I.'s outing literature, but that are understood to be the actual reason for the stop. Mrs. Hartwell had timed the stop for 11, and announced this 3 times before departure, and once at the first unscheduled pause, which occurred at 20 miles, when Mrs. Beach discovered that her tablets were in Mr. Beach's jacket, which was in the luggage compartment. They arrived at the halfway house at 11 minutes past 11, close enough to the plan that Mrs. Hartwell was satisfied, and the party dispersed with the eagerness of 17 people who have been sitting in a motor coach for 2 hours. Miss Marple went inside and took tea and a plain biscuit, and she found a seat near the window that looked out over the car park, the garden gate, and a good portion of the main room still occupied by people in the process of redistributing themselves. She had no particular plan. She rarely did, at this stage of things. She simply settled in with her tea and let the scene arrange itself. The thing she noticed, and she noticed it at 11:22, because the clock behind the counter was perfectly visible, and she had been looking at it when the relevant movement occurred, was Mr. Thomas Cragg returning from the direction of the facilities. He had been wearing a brown tweed jacket of the substantial country sort, the kind made for decades of use in all weathers, with suede patches at the elbows, and a particular way of sitting on large shoulders that made the garment look less like clothing and more like an architectural feature. When he came back from the corridor beyond the garden gate, he was wearing Mrs. Petch's blue coat. Not a blue coat, her specific blue coat. Miss Marple had been watching it from 2 rows ahead for the preceding 2 hours, and she could not have mistaken it. That particular insistent Saxon blue, that specific quality of good wool worn with long acquaintance. Mrs. Petch was standing in the car park with her back to the window. She was wearing Mr. Cragg's brown tweed. They spoke for perhaps 90 seconds, the two of them beside a low stone wall at the car park's edge. Miss Marple could not hear the exchange, but she could read the posture of it. Mrs. Petch with both hands gripping her own elbows in the gesture of someone stating a case that matters urgently. Cragg nodding 3 times in the slower, considered way of a man agreeing to something whose exact nature he is not going to press for. Then Mrs. Petch put her right hand briefly on his forearm, the quick, grateful pressure of someone who has been heard, and turned back toward the coach. Cragg watched her go, and then went back inside, in the blue coat, moving toward the 3rd row on the right-hand side. Mrs. Petch came around from the rear of the coach, in the brown tweed, and boarded from the back steps. She moved to row 4 on the left-hand side, without looking at anyone, and sat down. The exchange had taken under 2 minutes. In that time, the Beach couple had been arguing about tablets. Miss Haverstock had been at the telephone. The Grangers had been somewhere at the back of the car park, with the view of the Chilterns that Mr. Beach had recommended. And Mrs. Hartwell had been in consultation with the driver about the schedule. There was no one positioned to have seen what Miss Marple had seen, and no reason, if they had seen it, that they would have registered it as anything beyond 2 people who had decided to exchange some piece of clothing, which did not generally constitute a mystery. Miss Marple replaced her teacup in its saucer, and thought. She thought, the note in row 5, Osworth's pocket. She thought, the cliff path at the seafront, which the literature had mentioned. She thought, a vivid blue coat, designed to be noticed and remembered, now worn by someone who was going to sit in a window seat, and wave, and be recalled as having been present and cheerful, all afternoon, in precisely that location. She thought, the reason Mrs. Petch had needed the coat to move without her was a reason she did not yet have the material to name. She pulled a thread in her knitting, and then she looked again at Mr. Cragg, who had just sat down in row 3, and she observed on the collar of his brown tweed, which he had put back on before re-entering the coach, a few threads of blue wool, fine and distinctive, entirely consistent with a garment that had, moments earlier, been draped over his shoulders. She filed the threads and said nothing, and the coach continued south. Chapter 3. The Seating Chart. First Drawing. They reached Penmouth-on-Sea at 1:30, and the promenade received them with the restrained enthusiasm of an English seaside on a cool August day. Grey light, a stiff wind off the channel, the smell of salt and frying fat, and the particular bleached-out quality of a landscape that has been heavily visited for a great many years, and has arrived at a settled peace with its own popularity. There was a fish-and-chip restaurant at the near end, and a donkey ride that Mrs. Hartwell had prearranged for anyone who wished it. There was a viewing platform at the cliff's edge, a concrete shelf overlooking the lower promenade, which the town's literature described as offering unparalleled channel views in clear conditions, and which today offered a very complete view of cloud. The party dispersed with the cheerful purposefulness of people released from a motor coach after 2 hours. Miss Marple walked the promenade at her own pace, and paid attention to where people went. She noted Gerald Osworth moving away from the group toward the cliff path, with the deliberate stride of a man who has an appointment he expects to be kept. She noted that the person in Mr. Cragg's brown tweed, Mrs. Petch, though Miss Marple was the only person on the promenade who knew this, set out in the same direction at an interval of perhaps 3 minutes, walking with a briskness that had nothing of the holiday in it. She noted that the person in the blue coat, Mr. Cragg, remained on the promenade, speaking at comfortable length to Tom and Lily Granger, and waving, at one point, across the road to Mrs. Beach, with the broad, cheerful visibility of someone who very much intends to be remembered as present. She did not go to the cliff path. She was too old, she told herself, and the wind was too cold, and there was something rather pleasant about the ice cream counter near the bandstand. She bought a modest vanilla, and sat on a bench, and watched the promenade, and thought about what she had already decided she was watching. At 10 minutes to 4, Gerald Osworth was not at the coach. At 5 minutes to 4, he remained absent, and Mrs. Petch, Hartwell's clipboard, made its displeasure felt. At 4 o'clock precisely, a young man from the pier came at a run along the promenade, with the expression of someone carrying news that is large and unwelcome, and within 15 minutes the afternoon had become something else entirely. Gerald Osworth had been found on the lower promenade, at the foot of the cliff staircase, in the particular stillness of the irrevocably dead. The police arrived, and were more numerous than the situation initially called for, which was the normal course of things in small seaside towns, on days when the tourist season has produced something other than its usual content. Statements were requested. The party remained. The statements were given. It was in the giving of them that Miss Marple, seated to one side with her knitting and her perfectly arranged expression of polite, elderly attention, began to draw the first chart. She had 17 accounts of 17 passengers in 17 seats, collected in the haphazard order in which the constable had approached people and in which people had volunteered information. She took each one and placed it in her mind with the care of a woman arranging a table for a dinner party at which the seating must be considered very precisely. Row 1, left, Miss Haverstock. Row 1 right, Mrs. Hartwell. Row 2 left, Miss Marple herself. Row 2 right, Lily Granger. Row 3 right window, Mrs. Petch. The blue coat, vivid as a signal, confirmed by every witness who had looked back from anywhere in the front half of the coach. Row 4, left aisle, Mr. Craig. The brown tweed confirmed by everyone in the rows behind him. Row 5, left, Mr. Osworth. Everyone agreed. Every account matched. Every person was exactly where they had been when they boarded at Church Lane. Miss Marple's needles clicked through the plain row. The chart as assembled was internally consistent, complete, and entirely comfortable. She looked at it from several angles, as one looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed in a room where it almost, but not quite, belongs. The chart, she noticed, described the arrangement on the outward journey. Every account, without exception, referred to positions observed before the halfway house, or at the very beginning of the day. Not one statement spoke specifically to where people had been on the return leg. People had spoken of the outward journey because the outward journey was the happy part, the part before anything had happened, the part they had been enjoying. The return was the part they had sat through in stunned collective silence, not looking at each other, and in the not looking they had registered very little of who was where. She thought the seating arrangement on the return journey was not what any of these accounts described. She thought the constable did not yet know what question to ask, which was the question of the return. She set the chart aside in her mind. Something in it did not yet fit, and the thing that did not fit was not visible until she had more material. She would have more material. She always did. Chapter 4. The Blue Coat. They reached Brambleton-under-Ash well after dark, driving up Church Lane at 8:30 with the particular collective exhaustion of people who have experienced something awful in a place they did not expect it, and now wish very much to be at home. The Lamb and Anchor had its lights on and its kitchen warm, and within half an hour the low-beamed front room contained 17 distressed day-trippers, and the atmosphere of a small community processing something large through the only medium that has historically proved adequate, which is conversation over something warm. Miss Marple took a corner table, a glass of warm water, and her knitting, and she listened for the next hour and 20 minutes with the absorption of a person who appears to be counting stitches. The blue coat was mentioned 16 times. This was a precise count, and she made it precisely, because the blue coat was the piece of information most freely and most vivid in circulation. Not Mrs. Petch's name exactly. Her name appeared in the sympathetic register. Poor woman, always keeps herself to herself. She must be in a dreadful state. But the coat. The blue coat at the coach steps. The blue coat at the railing overlooking the lower prom. The blue coat that someone had seen waving from near the bandstand. The blue coat that had been visible if you looked back from any position in the first 3 rows, every time the coach had been in motion. Mrs. Petch was wearing it now. She sat in the corner diagonally opposite Miss Marple's, eating nothing, holding a glass of water she had not touched. She had the blue coat on over her blouse, and she looked, in it, exactly as she always looked, a small, quiet woman wearing a coat the color of strong feeling, which had always seemed to Miss Marple a slightly incongruous combination, the more she considered it. The coat had reboarded the coach. 16 people had seen it do so. 16 people were entirely certain. A coat is a coat, thought Miss Marple. She thought what the coat's witnesses had seen, with complete accuracy, was a blue coat boarding a Charabanc at the Penmouth seafront. What they had decided they had seen. The leap made between coat and person that the human mind makes without effort or awareness, was Mrs. Petch. The decision had been made in the fraction of a second and had never been examined, because there was at the time no reason to examine it. She thought, could any person in this room, if asked, describe Mrs. Petch's face? Not the coat, the face, the specific set of her features, the particular gray of her eyes, the way the corner of her mouth sat when she was not speaking. Most of them had known her for years, and most of them, Miss Marple suspected this with the quiet, sad certainty of long experience, would find, if pressed, that what they knew was the coat. She went upstairs at 10 o'clock, to the comfortable if draughty room on the first floor, and sat by the window and looked at the dark village green for some time, and thought about the cliff path and the note in the 5th row, and the one person who had stood on the promenade and waved with the bright, memorable certainty of a signal. Chapter 5. A Matter of Mortgages. In the morning, information accumulated in the way it does in villages. Not announced, not confided, but released quietly into the ambient knowledge of the community through the 100 small conduits of daily proximity that make the keeping of secrets over the long term such a very exhausting occupation. Mrs. Hartwell arrived at the Lamb and Anchor at 10:30, ostensibly to return a knitting needle that Miss Marple had apparently left on the coach. She had not. She had counted them twice. But she understood the social function of the pretext and received it with gratitude, and settled into the small sitting room off the lounge with the posture of a woman who has decided to put down something heavy. She was a kind person, scrupulously fair in her assessments of other people, and she was clearly wrestling with the question of whether fairness to the living required information to be shared or withheld, or handed to someone capable of making use of it correctly. She said, after a period of preliminary conversation about the weather and the morning's police activities, that Gerald Osworth had held mortgages on 4 properties in the village. One of them was the Petch cottage, on the far side of the church. Miss Marple said she was sorry to hear it. Mrs. Hartwell said that Robert Petch had died 3 years ago, and that the death had left a number of things in a complicated state. She chose the word complicated with the care of someone who knows a simpler word exists and has decided not to use it. Robert had been involved, in the last 2 years of his life, in certain financial arrangements. She paused here, and looked at the window, that had come to light only after his death, and that were not, in Mrs. Hartwell's opinion, the sort of arrangements a man wished his wife to have to account for, posthumously, to a solicitor who held the mortgage on her home. And had Osworth, Miss Marple asked, been the solicitor in question? He had. He had known about Robert's accounts, or rather, He had known about the irregularities in Robert's accounts, in the way that a solicitor holding a 6-year mortgage on a property knows about the private financial circumstances of the person who owes him money, quietly, completely, and with no obligation to share the knowledge. Had Mrs. Petch known, Miss Marple asked, that Osworth knew? She had found out, Mrs. Hartwell said slowly, some time after the estate was settled. She had found out in the way that women in that position tend to find out such things, when the information becomes useful to someone else. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and said only that she understood, and she thought she understood rather more than Mrs. Hartwell had explicitly said. She had known enough men of Osworth's type over many years to recognize the shape of the arrangement, the quiet, patient knowledge kept in reserve, the periodic reminder of it, the incremental demands that never quite amounted to anything that would hold up in a court of law, and therefore could not be addressed in one. She turned to the question of Tom Granger, which she had been holding at the back of her mind since the previous day's statements. Granger was an obvious suspect, and she had no intention of allowing him to remain one. He was 29, large, publicly angry about Osworth's behavior on the planning committee, and had been heard in the public bar 3 weeks before the outing, making a remark about Osworth that was the sort of remark people make when they do not mean anything specific, and are then deeply inconvenienced when someone specific occurs. He had a clear motive and very little capacity for concealment, which were, in Miss Marple's experience, a combination that generally indicated innocence rather than guilt. Guilty people, on the whole, cultivate the appearance of having nothing to conceal. Granger was unconcealed down to his bones. His statement, however, contained an error, a small one, of the sort that only becomes visible when placed against another piece of information. He said he had seen Mrs. Petch, in the blue coat, wave at him from near the ice cream counter at the bandstand. At 20 minutes to 4, Miss Marple had been sitting on the bench beside the bandstand. The ice cream counter had been directly in her line of sight for the preceding 40 minutes. Mrs. Petch, the woman in the blue coat, whoever she actually was, had not been there at 20 minutes to 4. Granger had not lied. Granger was, she felt certain, incapable of that particular kind of constructed dishonesty. He had misremembered the time, or misattributed the wave, or reconstructed the afternoon, in the way that people reconstruct afternoons that have since become distressing. By borrowing a detail from one moment and placing it in another, where it serves the more comfortable narrative. He had, in other words, performed the same innocent, automatic act of misremembering that every other witness had performed. She said nothing of any of this to Mrs. Hartwell, who left at noon, her errand accomplished. Miss Marple took her coat and walked to the village hall, where the inspector was interviewing people in the small committee room, and she joined the queue of people waiting to speak to him. And she waited with her knitting, and the patience of a woman to whom patience has long since become indistinguishable from simply paying attention. Chapter 6. The Seating Chart, Redrawn. The inspector was a sensible man of middle years, who had been in his profession long enough to know what witnesses think they saw, and what witnesses actually saw, are not always the same document. He interviewed in alphabetical order, which was not the most illuminating approach, but which Miss Marple respected as a system. And by the time she had heard 6 accounts from the waiting queue, offered in the carrying tones of people who are nervous and have therefore slightly elevated their volume, she had enough new material to perform a second reconstruction. The contradictions were small. This was always the case. Large contradictions announce themselves. Small ones accumulate quietly until they constitute something that cannot be ignored. Mrs. Beach, in her statement, she had seen Mr. Cragg in row 4, on the left side, on the return journey from Penmouth. She was absolutely certain because she could see the back of his bald head from her position in row 7, and she had been looking at it for most of the journey because her husband had fallen asleep and she had nothing else to do. Miss Haverstock, in her statement, she had seen Mr. Cragg in row 3, on the right side, on the return journey. She was quite certain because she had leaned forward to ask him about the Penmouth Cricket Club. She had seen a sign and was curious, and he had answered without turning round. Lily Granger, in her account to her husband, which she repeated for anyone in the waiting room who wished to hear it, which was several people. She had noticed, on the return, that there seemed to be brown where there had been blue, in the middle rows. She could not say which row exactly. She had thought Mrs. Petch might have taken off her coat, which sometimes happened when coaches became warm. Miss Marple set down her needles on her lap, and walked back through the coach. She walked it in her mind, as she had been doing in fragments since the previous afternoon, but now she walked it from back to front and front to back, placing each witness in their reported position, and she found that when she reached rows 3 and 4, the arrangement would not settle. 2 witnesses had placed Cragg in row 3. 1 had placed him in row 4. 3 others, from further back, had mentioned only the blue coat in the middle section, without specifying row. The coat itself, the blue coat, appeared in every account that referenced the right-hand middle section of the coach. Where it sat on the return, not one person had specified precisely, because not one person, it seemed, had looked. She held the chart in her mind, and found that when she tried to move the pieces into consistency, a name refused to stay fixed. Mr. Cragg, whom she had placed with certainty in row 4, kept migrating, in the testimony, to row 3. And the coat, which everyone agreed had been in the right-hand window seats on the outward journey, had been seen, on the return, by Lily Granger as brown, where blue had been, which could only mean that the blue coat had moved. She thought Mrs. Beach saw a bald head in row 4 on the return. Mr. Cragg is bald. Mr. Beach is also bald, and Mr. Beach was in row 7. She thought, in the glass of the coach window, in certain lights, a man in row 7 might cast a reflection that falls across row 4. She thought Miss Haverstock heard a voice answer her from row 3, right side, but she had asked about cricket, and more than one person on the coach could have answered a cricket question without turning round. She thought Lily Granger saw brown in the middle rows where blue had been. She saw it correctly, because on the return, the blue coat was in row 4, left side, and the brown tweed was in row 3, right side, and the arrangement was precisely the inverse of what every account described, because the arrangement had been changed at the halfway house, and had remained changed for the entire return journey. She picked up her needles again. The picture in her mind had shifted, quietly, completely, with the slight lurch of a view that resolved from confusion into sense. She thought the person who had reboarded the coach at the Penmouth seafront, in the blue coat, waving, visible to everyone on the promenade. That person was Thomas Cragg, who had been performing the function of Mrs. Petch's alibi for the last 5 hours, with the uncomplicated goodwill of a man who thought he was doing a small, kind thing. She thought, who had actually seen Mrs. Petch's face on the return journey? Anyone? Chapter 7. A Question of Faces. She asked, over the remainder of that day and the morning following, a question that she phrased differently each time she asked it. The phrasing changed, the question did not. To Mrs. Hartwell, whom she met on the way to the post office, she said she had been trying to picture the day in her mind, and found she could only recall people by what they were wearing. Faces slipped so in a crowd, didn't they? And asked whether this was Mrs. Hartwell's experience too. Mrs. Hartwell said that she was very much the same, honestly, and that if you asked her to describe any individual face from the coach, she thought she would struggle. The whole afternoon had gone rather strange in the memory. To Miss Haverstock, buying stamps at the counter, she mentioned the cricket question, such a curious detail to have remembered, and asked whether she had seen Mr. Cragg's face when he answered, or only heard the answer. Miss Haverstock considered. She had heard the answer, she said slowly. He had not turned round. She had assumed it was Mr. Cragg because of the position. To Tom Granger, who she encountered hammering something into a post at the far end of the lane, she said she was sorry to trouble him, but she was trying to get the afternoon straight in her mind. He had mentioned the blue coat waving near the bandstand. Could he describe the person wearing it? Not the coat, the face. Was it Mrs. Petch specifically? Granger set down his hammer and thought with the honest effort of a man who wishes to be accurate. He said he supposed he had assumed it was her. From the coat, it was such a bright blue, you noticed it. He had not actually, he admitted, looked at the face. To Mrs. Beach she raised the topic of Mr. Cragg's bald head, visible from row 7 on the return journey, and asked whether she had seen it directly or in the glass. Beach said, with sudden uncertainty, that she thought she had seen it directly. But the windows did sometimes. Yes, she supposed she might have been looking at a reflection. She had not considered it. None of them had lied. Not a single one. They had each told what they remembered. And what they remembered was the coat. The blue coat, as reliable as a landmark, as vivid as a painted sign. And they had supplied the face from memory and habit and the reasonable expectation that people wear their own clothes. No one could describe Mrs. Petch's face. They could describe the coat to the last button. Miss Marple walked back to the Lamb and Anchor in the early afternoon, and she walked through what she now understood, and she found that it fitted with the cleanness of a thing that was not constructed, but simply true. The blue coat had reboarded the coach. The blue coat had waved and been remembered, and had occupied row 3 on the right for the entire return journey. And Mrs. Petch, in the brown tweed, invisible, occupying the quiet left-hand middle of the coach, had gone entirely unremembered, because no one looks at a nondescript coat in a middle seat when there is a striking blue coat to attend to. She thought Thomas Cragg had worn the coat, and occupied the seat, and answered a question about cricket, and waved at someone from the promenade, all in the genuine helpful belief that he was allowing a bilious woman to sit somewhere quiet without a fuss being made about it. He had no idea what he had done. That was the particular, terrible cleanness of the thing. She thought she needed to speak to Mrs. Petch. Before the inspector's next round of questioning, which was scheduled, Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned, for the following morning. Chapter 8. The Seating Chart Corrected. She spent the afternoon in her room with the door closed, which she did when she needed to think without the effort of appearing to think about something else. The room was small, clean, and had a window that looked out over the village green. The quince tree at the edge of the green, a very old tree, gnarled in the way of quinces that have been productive for more years than anyone currently living can account for, was just beginning its late summer wait, the fruits still green and not yet ready, hanging with the patient abundance of things that are in no hurry to be finished. She looked at it for a while, in the way one looks at trees when one needs to think, and finds that looking at something outside oneself helps the inside to settle. She laid out the coach as it had actually been. Row 3, right-hand window, Mr. Thomas Cragg, wearing the blue coat, sitting in Mrs. Petch's seat, performing, entirely without knowing it, the function of her presence for the afternoon. Row 4, left-hand side, Mrs. Petch, wearing the brown tweed, sitting in Cragg's seat. Unremarkable, unremembered, as absent from the afternoon's collective memory as if she had never boarded. This had been the arrangement from the halfway house forward, from the moment of the exchange in the car park, for the entire remainder of the day. This was not the arrangement anyone had described, because the arrangement anyone had described was the arrangement of the morning, before the halfway house, which was the part everyone had been enjoying and therefore attending to. The afternoon, from the halfway house to the seafront, had been a period in which the blue coat was Mrs. Petch, and Mrs. Petch was the blue coat, and the exchange was invisible, because no one had reason to look for it. In the coach, riding south, on the promenade, where Mr. Cragg in the blue coat had waved at Tom Granger, and chatted with the Grangers for an hour, and been cheerfully, visibly, entirely present, while Mrs. Petch, went where she needed to go. She had gone where Osworth had summoned her, in the note passed through the coach window at 8:28. She had gone to the cliff path and the viewing platform. She had gone knowing what he would ask, because it was always the same thing, dressed in different clothing. And she had gone in a coat that made her invisible. The brown tweed of a man 63 years old, broad-shouldered, thick-set. When she stood at the cliff's edge, and Osworth turned from the railing, he would have seen a figure he did not recognize. The figure he would have recognized was on the promenade, waving. After she had returned to the coach and taken her seat in row 4, and pulled the tweed around her, and sat quietly for the entire return, in the knowledge that no one was looking at her, and no one had been. And the blue coat had been in row 3, faithfully present, being Mrs. Petch. Thomas Cragg had lent her the morning's invisible hour. He had done it because she had asked him, and because he is a decent man, and because she had given him a reason, illness, the need for quiet, that he had accepted without pressing, because men of his temperament do not press women who are clearly in some difficulty. He had no idea, and she had known he would have no idea, and she had used this knowledge in the way that small, quiet people sometimes use their understanding of good-natured people, carefully, and with the knowledge of the cost. Miss Marple set the chart down in her mind. It was complete. Every position was correct, every witness was accounted for, every misremembering was explained. The thing had been done with a precision that was not natural to Mrs. Petch. It was not in any way the action of a practiced criminal, but with the particular desperate precision of a person who has been given enough time to think, who has thought very carefully, and who has arrived at the one arrangement that makes the impossible look routine. She rose, and put on her coat, and took up her knitting bag, because she always took her knitting to these conversations, as it gave her hands something to do, and the other person something to observe that was not a face. She went downstairs, and out of the Lamb and Anchor, and along the lane toward the church, and past the church to the far side, where the Petch cottage stood, at the end of a wall of old lime mortar and sweetbriar. Chapter 9. Mrs. Petch's Garden. The garden was the garden of someone who had been paying it more attention than anything else in the world for a considerable time. Not a showy garden, no dahlias arranged for effect, no herbaceous borders planted for the admiration of passers-by, but a working garden, practical and very slightly overgrown at the margins, with the look of a place that has been weeded and tidied and then left to its own devices during some period when the person tending it had other things requiring attention. There were sweet williams along the near wall, and a stand of lavender that had gone somewhat leggy, and in the corner a quince tree very like the one on the village green, old and gnarled and absolutely indifferent to what was happening inside the cottage. Mrs. Petch was sitting on a wooden bench at the garden's edge, in the blue coat. She was not doing anything, she was simply there, in the way that people are simply somewhere when they have no particular inclination to be elsewhere. She looked up when she heard the gate, and she looked at Miss Marple for a long moment, and her expression contained no surprise. She said, "I wondered if it would be you." Miss Marple sat on the low stone seat opposite the bench. There was no second chair, but the stone was adequate, and set her knitting in her lap, and she did not approach the matter indirectly. Indirection, in her experience, was not useful in these conversations. People who have lived with a thing for some time, and have made their peace with the fact of it, do not require to be brought gently to the point. They have been at the point for rather longer than is comfortable, and what they want, what they find in the end, something close to relief, is to be at it with someone else present. She said, "Mr. Cragg didn't know. He thought he was helping you with a moment of illness." Mrs. Petch looked at the quince tree. She said, "No, he didn't know. He's a very decent man. He has been very kind to me in general, over the years. He didn't deserve to be made use of, and he has no idea that he was." Miss Marple said, "There was a note. Mr. Osworth received it at the coach window that morning. Did you send it?" She said, "He sent it. He always sent notes. Everything in writing. Very careful. Nothing that could be used in a legal context. All quite plausible. He had asked me to meet him at the viewing platform at 3:30. He said he had a proposal." Miss Marple said, "His proposals, as you understood them." Mrs. Petch said, "He had been asking, since November, for the cottage. Not the mortgage. He had held the mortgage for 6 years, and the arrangements about the mortgage were the thing that held everything in place. But the cottage itself, the property outright, transferred to him, and whatever remained in the accounts, and in exchange, the information about Robert's accounts would go no further, and she would be free of him." She said it without hesitation, in the flat, even tone of someone reciting a thing that has been rehearsed through repetition, not constructed in the moment, but worn smooth with use. "Robert had borrowed from the client account," she said then, not looking at Miss Marple, but at the garden, "during the last 2 years of his life. Not large amounts individually, but the pattern of them amounted to something that would have been, had it come to light, a criminal matter. Robert had not been a wicked man. He had been a frightened man, and the fear had made him do a foolish thing, and then the thing had required protecting, and the protection had required worse things than the original foolishness, as that pattern tends to go. He had died before it unraveled. And Osworth had been at the funeral, she said, very proper, very correct, and had written to her 2 weeks after. Very kind letters. Always very kind. Miss Marple said, gently, "For 3 years. For 3 years," she said. Yes. The amounts had increased. The demands had become more specific. And then, in November, he had written about the cottage, and she had realized that there would be no end to it, as long as there was anything left to ask for. A man of that kind, she paused, looking for the word, and then found it. A man of that kind does not stop because you have given him what he asked for. He stops when there is nothing remaining. She said, "I went to the viewing platform at 3:30. He was there. He told me about the buyer he had found for the cottage. He had a buyer, he said, a good offer, and I would need to vacate by the 1st of October. He said it was the final arrangement, and then there would be no further contact." She was quiet for a moment. A lavender in the corner was moving in the small late-afternoon wind. The quince tree was entirely still. She said, "I had thought, for a very long time, that I would not. I had thought right up until the viewing platform that I would find some other arrangement, some way through. I had been thinking for 2 years about some other arrangement." Miss Marple said nothing. She said there was no other arrangement. There had never been one. I understood that on the viewing platform. The cliff was very close. He had turned back toward the rail to look at the channel, and he said the buyer was motivated to complete quickly, and he said it as though it were a perfectly ordinary piece of business. And I— She stopped. She set her hands flat on her thighs and looked at them. She said, "I had not planned it. I want to be clear about that, not because it matters to the law, but because it is the truth. I had not planned it." She said, "I know what I did was wrong." She said it simply and without decoration, as one states a fact one has been living with long enough that it has long since lost the power to surprise. Not seeking absolution, not appealing for sympathy, simply confirming a thing she had been clear about since the moment it occurred. Miss Marple sat with the garden for a moment. She thought about the marriages she had known, and not the fortunate ones. Those were rarer than people liked to believe, and she had learned not to build her understanding of human nature on exceptions. She thought about the long ones, the ones that had accumulated, over years, a weight of experience that was not evenly distributed between the two people carrying it. She thought about the particular kind of endurance that is imposed from outside and accepted from necessity, the way a person learns to carry what they are given until the weight changes shape without warning and becomes something they cannot set down. She thought, Robert Petch had done something foolish and frightened, and had involved his wife in the consequences without, in all probability, ever telling her clearly what the consequences were. He had left her to discover them piecemeal, in a solicitor's correspondence after his death. He had left her carrying something she had not been asked whether she would carry. She thought about Gerald Osworth, who had sat with that knowledge for 6 years, and had used it with the particular patience of a man who understands that the leverage a thing provides is greatest when it is maintained, not exercised. He had asked for what he could get, and when he had got it he had asked for more, and when he had asked for more, he had found there was more still. And he had kept asking until there was the cottage, and then he had asked for the cottage. She thought he had calculated with the professional precision of a long career that she would comply. He had studied the shape of her compliance for 3 years, and had concluded that it was unlimited. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about the particular quality of compliance that is, in fact, simply the endurance of someone who has not yet found the place where endurance runs out. She thought justice is the law's business. Mercy is the law's difficulty. She was neither. She said, "Mrs. Petch, I shall need to speak to Inspector Lawson this evening. I will come with you, if you would like that." Petch said, "Yes." She said it without delay and without relief, with the tone of a woman who has been expecting a door to open, and who, now that it has, finds she is ready to go through it. She said, "I have been thinking these 3 days about whether there was another way through, whether there was something I had missed." "Was there?" asked Miss Marple. She looked at the garden. She said, "No, I have been quite thorough about it." Miss Marple said, "I believe you." She meant it entirely. They sat for a while in the garden as the light began its late summer change, moving from the bright particular gold of afternoon to the longer, softer quality that precedes the Cotswolds' dusk. The sweet williams along the wall were at their very end, the last of them, and the lavender had gone the dry gray blue of lavender that has finished its season and is beginning to become something it will be for the winter. The quince tree stood at the garden's corner with the ancient uncommunicative patience of old fruit trees, which have outlasted a great many people and their concerns, and have arrived at a perspective on the matter that is not consoling, but is, in its way, accurate. She had thought, for many years, that the weight does not crush a person all at once. It is the daily adjustment to the weight that wears you down in the end. When you have adjusted to it so completely that you cannot imagine what you weighed before, that is when you are most dangerous to yourself and to the person imposing it, because neither of you can see how far it has gone. She thought it now, in the garden, and she said nothing, because there was nothing useful left to say. They walked up the lane together as it grew dark. Petch in the blue coat, and Miss Marple beside her, and the village received them with the ordinary indifference of a village evening in late August. A dog barking behind a gate, the smell of someone's supper, the church clock beginning its 7 o'clock sequence, and neither of them hurried, and neither of them spoke particularly, and the inspector's light was on at the end of the lane. And that is that. A charabanc, a coat, 17 witnesses, each entirely honest, each entirely wrong about the most important thing they thought they had seen. I've been sitting with the question I asked you at the beginning. Have you ever been certain you saw something, and found the certainty itself was the problem, not the seeing? This story, for me, is really about that. The way we stop looking at people and start looking at what we know about them, the coat they always wear, and the seat they always take, and the moment that habit of recognition becomes the thing someone else can use against us. We see what we expect to see. We fill the gaps from memory, and we are absolutely, sincerely certain that we have seen clearly. Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this has happened to you, if you've ever had someone use what you assumed about them to make themselves invisible to you, or if it's happened the other way around, I'd be glad to hear that too. If Midnight Pages is where you come for a good story and a quiet evening, I'm very glad it is. Subscribe if you haven't already, so the next story finds you. There are always more stories. There always are. This is David. Good night from Ohio. The coat is never quite the person, and the person, if you haven't looked closely in a while, may not be quite who you remember.